Have you ever noticed how many sales conversations these days just sound exactly the same? Everywhere you look, businesses are talking about AI, automation, agent force, digital transformation, intelligent workflows, smart reporting and connected customer experiences. Every conference presentation feels bigger than the last. Every roadmap promises acceleration. Every consultancy deck talks about innovation. And if you listen closely enough, you start getting the impression that future problems businesses face will somehow be solved by simply adding more technology. But while all of that noise is happening, there's another story quietly unfolding underneath it. A much less glamorous story that very few organizations are openly talking about. And that's the story that users are just simply overwhelmed. Not because they dislike technology, not because they're unwilling to adapt, and not because sales itself is inherently difficult. Most of the time, users become overwhelmed because organizations accidentally place them at the very end of the conversation instead of at the center of it. And I think this starts much earlier in projects than businesses just realize. If you look at the average Salesforce implementation, the beginning of the project is usually filled with a bundle of energy. Leadership is excited, project teams are assembled, partners are engaged, workshops begin, roadmaps are created, and deadlines are agreed. Everybody starts talking about features, integration, automation, and future efficiencies. There's momentum everywhere. It feels strategic, it feels transformative, and it feels really, really important. But quietly, underneath all that activity, a dangerous assumption often forms very early on. And that's the assumption that users will simply adapt later. And because of that assumption, many organizations unintentionally spend months designing systems around processes, governance structures, reporting requirements, and technical possibilities before they truly understand the people expected to operate inside that very platform every single day. And that's the part I think businesses massively underestimate. Because there's a huge difference between designing a technically correct system and designing a system that real human beings can confidently operate under pressure on a busy Tuesday afternoon when they have 20 other things happening all at the same time. One of the most common things I see during projects is that organizations believe they're involving users because they included a handful of managers or senior stakeholders in the workshops. But operational users and leadership often experience the business in completely different ways. Leadership, they see processes, metrics, governance, and reporting structures. Users experience interruptions, customer pressure, workload balancing, workaround, and practical realities. And both perspectives matter enormously. But too often, only one of those perspectives heavily shape the final design. I've seen projects where sales teams were barely consulted about how they actually manage conversations with customers. I've seen service teams receive workflows that look logical in workshop, but collapse under real call volumes when they start coming through. I've seen system designs around perfect process flows without enough conversation of how unpredictable real operational environments actually are. And the strange thing is, none of these decisions are usually made with bad intentions. Most projects generally want to improve the business. But projects are often driven by timelines, delivery pressure, and technical milestones. Therefore, the focus naturally moves towards getting the platform built, getting functionality delivered, and getting the project towards that very important finish line. Meanwhile, enablement becomes something people assume that can be solved later through a few training sessions near go live or just after go live. This is where many businesses accidentally create long-term adoption problems before users even touch the system. Because if users are not properly identified early in the project, organizations will struggle to understand what different groups genuinely need from the platform. That the finance team works differently from sales, that sales is different from service, and service different from operations, and that senior managers use systems differently from frontline users, and that experienced employees behave differently from new starters. Yet many organizations still approach enablement as if all users can simply group together under one generic training platform. And that creates enormous disconnect later. What often happens is that businesses design systems around functionality first and user behavior second. Then once the build is almost complete, somebody is going to ask the question, how are we actually going to train everybody on this? At that point, the organization is no longer shaping the system around the users. The users are now expected to shape themselves around the system. And that is a very different scenario. And I think this is why so many organizations struggle with adoption after go live without fully understanding the root cause. Often they believe the issue started during training, but in reality, the issue often started months earlier during discovery and design phase. Because if users were not deeply understood, if operational realities were not properly explored, if departments were not sufficiently involved, and if the project team never truly identified how people actually work on a day-to-day basis, then training becomes incredibly difficult regardless of how good the trainer is. A great trainer can explain a process beautifully, but if the process itself feels disconnected from reality, users will just struggle to embrace it. People may follow it temporarily because leadership is watching closely after go live, but eventually human behavior always drifts towards what feels practical and manageable under this day-to-day pressure. That's why I always have believed enablement should not become near the end of the project. It should influence the project from the very start. Good enablement is not simply about teaching people where to click. It's about helping shape an environment that users can realistically succeed in. And honestly, I think the organizations that do this well behave very differently during projects. They are the ones that spend more time listening to users very early on. They will observe workflows instead of relying on workshop assumptions. They will identify different user groups properly instead of treating everybody the same. They will involve operational teams in meaningful ways during testing and feedback cycles. They will ask uncomfortable questions about workload, usability, and operational pressure. They recognize that adoption is heavily influenced by whether users feel included in the journey rather than having change imposed on them from above. Because when users feel excluded from system design, something very important happens psychologically. The platform will stop feel like something built to support them, and it starts to feel like something being forced onto them. That emotional difference matters far more than many businesses realize. People naturally support environments they feel ownership of. When users can see their feedback reflected in processes, when they feel heard during project decisions, and when they recognize the operational realities inside the final system design, then resistance will drop dramatically. The platform will feel familiar, logical, human. But when users feel disconnected from the project, adoption often becomes performative. They follow processes because they have to, not because they truly believe in the system itself. That distinction is incredibly important. Because organizations often focus heavily on technical go-live success, while underestimating emotional go-live success. A platform can technically launch perfectly while users quietly feel anxious, disconnected, and overwhelmed underneath the surface. And those feelings do matter, because they shape behavior, they shape confidence, and they shape long-term adoption. I sometimes think businesses just forget how disruptive major implementations actually are for operational staff. For project teams, sales and implementations are exciting strategic initiatives. For users, they can feel like fundamental changes to familiar working habits, reporting expectations, performance visibility, and daily routines all at the same time. That is why good projects create familiarity early. They bring users into the conversation. They allow feedback loops. They test assumptions properly. They use pilots intelligently. They identify friction before go live instead of after. And most importantly, they stop treating enablement as final stage of delivery and start treating it as a strategic thread running through the entire project lifecycle. Because by the time you reach formal training sessions, many of the most important adoption decisions have already been made. The system either reflects how people realistically work, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, no amount of last-minute training will solve that problem. And I honestly believe this is one of the biggest hidden reasons why some Salesforce projects quietly struggle after launch. Not because the technology failed, but because businesses spend too much time designing the platform and not enough time designing the human experience around that platform. The irony is that organizations often discover this way too late. Usually after go live, when managers start noticing inconsistent behavior, low confidence, support dependency, reporting issues, and workarounds. Then the conversation showed a shift towards users' adoption problems, when in reality many of those problems were created upstream during project design itself. And perhaps that's the real conversation more businesses need to start having. Not simply asking whether the system is technically impressive, but asking whether the people inside the organization were generally part of the journey from the very beginning. Because when users are identified properly, involved properly, listened to properly, and supported properly, something powerful will happen. Salesforce will stop feeling like a corporate initiative happening to people and start feeling like a platform designed to genuinely help them succeed in their roles. And honestly, I think that difference is what separates projects that merely go live from projects that truly become part of how a business successfully operates long term.